Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable on critical perspectives on co-development or co-production in global health. I'm Andy Gibbs. I'm split between South Africa and the UK. And I guess what we wanted to do in this roundtable is really bring together a number of different people, different projects who have all been thinking about how to do co-development processes around global health, many of them on violence against women, but not all of them, and to really think through kind of both the process and some of the problems and pitfalls of this kind of approach. And so what we'll do now is have our presenters kind of talk for 10 to 15 minutes on each of their projects. And that'll be the starting point of the roundtable. So can I hand over now to Jenevieve to talk us through her work?
Sure. I'm just going to share my screen. Yes, you can see that okay? Great. Okay. So my name is Jenevieve Mannell. I'm an associate professor in global health at UCL. And most of my work has to do around violence prevention, specifically violence against women prevention. But I'm also very much interested in intervention development and looking at how we can use participatory methods in order to design and co-develop interventions. So today's talk is really about some work that we're doing in Samoa, and really sort of specifically looking at this case study around developing a theory of change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off talking about what a theory of change is a little bit, give it a little bit of a background to what I think it is anyway. And then talking about violence against women in Samoa and sort of the context around the project that I'm going to sort of use as a case study today. And the methods that we've really used in sort of developing a theory of change. So really getting at some of the things that have worked and some of the things that haven't worked so well in developing a theory of change for violence prevention in Samoa. And then I'll talk about some of the results of that process. And really what I want to do is reflect on the importance of local epistemologies and sort of thinking about theories of change and theoretical meaning making in general in this context. So what is a theory of change? So I think when we think of theory, just as a big concept, we tend to think of things like Foucault or Bourdieu, and sort of the big scholars that have come up with really grand theories of sociology usually. But theories of change are not that at all. They're very much pragmatic tools that are used within intervention development to really make the implicit assumptions that we have about why interventions work much more explicit and bringing them out as part of conversations that are happening. And I think this builds very much from the use of logic models by a lot of international NGOs and their donors. So really thinking about, so logic models were based on looking at inputs. So what goes into an intervention, what are the outputs that come out of those inputs, and then what are the outcomes that we expect to see? But theories of change take this a little bit a step further and really try to unpack the input-output model a little bit in more detail. And really say, what are the mechanisms by which we expect particular intervention activities to lead to specific outcomes. So really kind of trying to unpick that black box in a little bit more detail, to me, is what a theory of change is. And so I think this ties really nicely into principles of co-production, or I think it often has for me and my own work anyway. And so theories of change are often developed by program managers within NGOs or within international organizations or within donor organizations. So thinking about sort of funding streams and how do we justify programs and interventions of work. But I think as we move towards co-production, thinking about how we can share power structures with people that we're working with and sort of dynamics between the global south and the global north and trying to adjust those dynamics so it's not just global north sort of making all the decisions for what's happening in the global south, but really trying to listen to local communities about what they think needs to change. I think with that shift, it really sort of provides a different way of looking at theories of change, that they're not just logic models that are used by donors or program managers any longer, but really how do we co-produce these theories of change with the people who are likely to benefit from the interventions in the first place? And how do we do that in a reflective way that sort of gets at these aspects of underlying power dynamics and trying to shift those power dynamics, as well as sort of challenging knowledge hierarchies that exist, particularly within global health, and ensuring equitable partnerships and so on and so forth. So these 7 principles of co-production really come into our theories of change and thinking about how we can co-develop theories of change. And this kind of co-production or co-design is really the heart of the project that we've been working on in Samoa. So the name of the project in Samoan is Elesao Alofa, and it means, the translation into English really is love shouldn't hurt. So it's a violence prevention intervention, but very much about co-production. So the whole purpose of the project over 4 years' time is to really work with local communities in Samoa in order to co-design an intervention to prevent violence, and then look at whether or not that co-design process actually works in preventing violence itself. So does the involvement of communities itself help to prevent violence? And that's the overall aim of the project. And so we've been working with 20 village representatives across 10 different villages across the country of Samoa, and 10 mentors. So each village has a male and a female representative and then 1 mentor. And we've been working with them in order to train them in research skills and trying to involve them in the process of not only designing the intervention, but trying to figure out what might work around an intervention. And so there's been a lot of build up to an actual intervention design that we've been working on. And the theory of change development has really been core to this. So really an iterative process of collecting information from villages and then coming back and developing our theory of change, which I'll talk about in more detail. But first, I just want to give you a little bit of a context about Samoa. It's not a country that everybody knows about or even can locate on a map, actually. So it is a very small country of just under 200,000 inhabitants, located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the Polynesian region. And it gained its independence from New Zealand in 1962, but still has really, really close links to New Zealand. And actually there's a population of Samoans that are located in New Zealand that is almost as big as Samoa itself. And so there's a huge link between the two communities of the expat community in New Zealand and the Samoan community in Samoa. But its closest neighbors are really American Samoa, which is still an American colony, but it's just next door. The country's sort of divided in 2 pieces back during colonization. And its closest neighbors are American Samoa, Fiji, and really Tonga. So really sort of, but these are quite distant neighbors. It's about 4.5-hour flight from New Zealand, to give you some perspective on just how in the middle of the Pacific Ocean it actually is. And violence against women is extremely high in Samoa. So this is the figures from the recent DHS mixed survey that was done in 2020. And it really showed that 52.3% actually of Samoan women have experienced violence within their lifetime. So this puts Samoa up in the highest rankings of countries with the highest prevalence anywhere in the world. And the interesting thing about the Pacific is that we don't really know what the causes are of violence in the Pacific. A lot of the risk factors that drive really high rates of violence in other parts of the world, such as armed conflicts or high rates of homicide in the general population, actually don't exist within Samoa in the same extent. And so it's a little bit, or in the Pacific in general, and so it's a little bit of a question as to what exactly is driving it. And so that's where the theory of change becomes even more complicated, because we don't really know what the risk factors or the causes are of violence in this context. And so this has been the overarching goal of the EVE project, so evidence for violence prevention in the extreme. So the Samoan case study is one case study as part of this broader project that's really about trying to understand what's happening in high prevalence settings, and why do certain countries in the world have really high prevalences of violence. And so just this sort of gives you the whole program of work as it is, but it shows you where the theory of change is situated. And so we've done a couple of years already of work sort of looking at local meanings of violence and its prevention, and then designing a theory of change that's really been out of those local meanings and local understandings of what violence is and how it might be prevented. And then we're moving forward into something that's a little bit more quantitative, of looking at a feasibility test of a prevalence tool and a pilot intervention to develop an intervention. So the pilot is about intervention development. But I'm going to talk about the first 2 years of this work, so really 2020 and 2021, and what we've been doing. And so the theory of change as part of this has really taken place over 4 stages. So first, we did semi-structured interviews with the 20 village representatives that I mentioned, who are part of the project from 10 different communities. So they attended a workshop at the very beginning where we were training them in research skills, and we did interviews as part of that workshop. And then they have gone out to their communities and done 3 interviews each with the community members. And so that was a really sort of a range of different community members. Often it was leaders in the village, so chiefs or people in other leadership roles, as well as people who were either part of the religious community, so thinking of pastors within the community, because Christianity is a predominant religion within the Samoan context. And then we also looked at people who maybe had gotten services for violence prevention in the past, and so on and so forth. And so there was a really sort of wide range of different people that we talked to. And then there were some community conversations that took place where the village representatives actually went out and did facilitated discussions with their communities around these issues. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And finally, we did some workshops with the village representatives to understand sort of causal pathways. And so I'll talk through each of these various steps and what I think we learned about theories of change through doing this as a process. So I'm going to start with the semi-structured interviews and the peer-led that were done both with the peer representatives or the village representatives and that they did as well with their community members. And so these semi-structured interviews were really about asking people what they thought the causes of violence were in their communities, and then what they thought could be done in order to prevent it, or what communities were already doing to prevent it. And we used thematic analysis of all of these interviews. So we had 80 in total. We've done thematic analysis to try to understand what some of the themes were that came out of this work. And so when we were looking at sort of causes of violence, so what actually do people think causes violence in their communities, there were 4 main themes that came up. One being sort of the abuse of power by men. So men are often in positions of authority, and that they tend and are certainly sort of seen as the head of families. And this is sort of something that's taken as given for many men. And so abuse of power by men was one of these things. Another was poor communication. So really misunderstandings in couples, and jealousy or couples falling out of love was mentioned. Third was looking at sort of family conflict. So a lot of people mentioned the fact that young people were particularly prone to violence in their relationships, and that there was financial stress, that any sort of alcohol consumption or gambling actually caused conflict within households. And then finally, social norms of violence. So violence is very much sort of seen as a private issue that you keep within your household and you don't tell anybody about, and that women were often blamed by both men and women for the violence that happened to them. And then we look at sort of mechanisms. And so there were 5 different sort of themes looking at kind of what people thought might be some of the solutions for violence in their communities. One, so they thought that, okay, well, we needed to work with men, sort of valuing women's roles and anger management, but we also need to work with women, sort of seeing their own value within society, as well as healing psychologically from some of the violence that they had experienced. But they also thought that actually a family strategy was really important. So working with families around counseling and respect, trying to unite couples and improve communication. And they also felt that church involvement was quite important. So involving ministers and pastors, but also sort of thinking about Christian values. And lastly, they talked about community intervention. So there are a number of things that communities already do to prevent violence. And one of those things is putting in place so that there's a village council that in many villages had decided to put together bylaws or fines for people who had actually perpetuated violence within their households. And I want to come back to this because I think this all looks quite promising in terms of, okay, there's actually a lot of things that we could do as far as an intervention to prevent violence. And we generated a lot of ideas that were sort of community driven and really sort of bottom up. But I think there's one small problem with what we did here in terms of trying to really get at a theory of change. So there were contradictions very much in what people said about these various mechanisms. And I don't think this was picked up by the thematic analysis. So in looking at themes and broad themes that were coming out of it, and the most sort of resilient or prevalent themes, we often had a difficult time going back and trying to figure out where these contradictions might lie and what was actually happening. So the contradictions tended to get lost. And one of these contradictions that did come out was very much around the village bylaws. And so you might think that actually having penalties to punish men for perpetuating violence might be a good thing, but it was seen very differently if you really look at sort of unpick the themes that we had. So whereas some people felt like the first person at the top here, that the village council really enforced punishments to men who abused women and girls, and that this was evidence that it could be stopped, actually, that if we just have sort of strict bylaws in place that actually can be stopped, and we need to start with communities. And so that's what they were saying. But then there's this other perspective that really came out in the ways that the bylaws were not actually stopping the violence, but creating more conflict within families because nobody wanted to pay for the penalties. And so it actually increased violence within sort of the family dynamics, but it also created a fear, I guess, of the financial penalty. So the financial penalty put more stress often on the family and on the husband who was perpetuating violence, which you could see could also potentially drive violence. And so the mechanism here was not quite unpicked by just looking at thematic analysis. So we needed to do something else in order to try to get at this contradiction that was happening. And one of the ways that we did that was these community conversations. And so we went back to the communities, or the village representatives did, after we did a workshop with the village representatives first and foremost, where we had them do a problem tree and a solution tree. So what are the problems that you sort of see happening around violence? What are the underlying problems? What's really sort of under the surface? And then how can we solve that? So what are the solutions to those problems? And for us, this was a way of collectively trying to understand the contradictions that might be happening within communities. And they took this out to their communities together with SVSG, our implementing partner, so the Samoa Victim Support Group. So they all facilitated some community conversations around this to try to get at these contradictions that were happening in communities and to get them to draw out their own sort of local solutions to how to deal with the contradictions. And this is really nice. It produced a really nice sort of problem solution tree and some ideal world scenarios of where we were trying to get to. So this was great. And I think it really kind of helped us unpick some of this detail and some of the nuance of it. But what it doesn't do in terms of a theory of change is that it didn't provide us with the connections so clearly. So how do things like sort of thinking about financial stress and unemployment lead into how is economic interventions or family interventions what's the mechanism of change that actually we think is operating here, what is actually happening in order to lead to violence reduction? And we started to do this and realized that actually we didn't really know. We didn't know what the underlying assumptions were that communities were making about these things. And then it was quite difficult to make the pathways without going back again to the communities and trying to unpack it. So we did that. We decided to hold a workshop with village representatives to try to get at these pathways. Okay, so now we've had these community conversations, we've done these interviews, we have all of this information. What are the pathways? How do we link these various things together? And we did a workshop where we gave them handouts that had a blank sort of section for each of these on pages, on a handout page. So problems, solutions, an ideal world. And so pick something, we said, from the problem list. Pick some, and then tell us what the solution is from the solution list that matches that problem. And what is the ideal world that you think that then leads to as an outcome. So don't get too excited about this. It really didn't work. It really didn't work. And I think what we ended up getting is sort of lists of really kind of easy answers. So thinking about alcohol consumption, okay, well, we put restrictions on alcohol consumption, then we get to an ideal world where we reduce physical violence because there's nobody's drinking. And it didn't really, still didn't help us unpick what we thought of as potential pathways. It just kind of gave us these easy answers of this might work, but not really kind of getting at the contradictions and the potential things, that the complexity that we were really, really looking for in this. So in the end, we did it ourselves. We created our own pathways. And I'm talking about us as being the project team based in the UK. And I think this raises all kinds of potential issues. So here we have, you know, the context that we sort of see, the problems that were identified, potential intervention components that were identified by the village representatives, and then potential outcomes, but the pathways and the outcomes are ours, are our sort of reflections. So this no longer really reflects local knowledge, and it doesn't really transfer power around that knowledge and that knowledge construction to local Samoan communities. All of a sudden we're using their words, but we're turning it into a framework that makes sense to us. And I think there's a risk in this, obviously, in sort of using Western frameworks to understand what are fundamentally local processes. And I've put a picture of Margaret Mead in Samoa here. So Margaret Mead was a very famous anthropologist who first went to Samoa and wrote a very famous book called Coming of Age in Samoa. And Samoans today sort of see this as the fault of anthropology, that they feel very strongly that Margaret Mead completely misinterpreted their way of life and understandings of adolescence within their culture and the cultural practices. And so I think there's the potential for falling into this similar trap with thinking about theories of change too, and that we might need to completely sort of blow apart this model, specifically the linearity of thinking about context and mechanisms and outcomes, and thinking about it as a process or input, output, outcome. I think this linearity may not actually be the best fit, and we might need different models for thinking about sort of indigenous frameworks. And so just to give you an example of something that came out of the theory of change process, and I think the theory of change process was extremely interesting and enlightening and built networks and did all of these sort of other things, even though it may not have given us a really clear idea of mechanisms. It did a lot of other things, or pathways. It gave us a lot of other things. And one of these things really came to the fore in this story that I want to tell about a process that we went through with ethical principles. So we tried to develop some ethical principles coming out of the interviews that they had done. And we wanted them to prioritize these ethical principles for the project, or to take them out, or to edit them in whatever way they said fit. And what they did, so we said, okay, so tell us what's the most important ethical principle, and we want you to rank them to the least important. So in a sense, another type of linear framework. And they said, no, we want to do it completely differently. Actually, we would put Christian values in the middle, because this is the heart of Samoa. And we want to put the principle of love at the very bottom, because it's really the foundation of everything. And so just this logic of how they completely shifted away from a linear framework to something that made more sense to them, sort of reminds me of the totem pole idea within Canadian First Nation communities of, you know, the position on the totem pole is important, but not in a linear way, in a positionality and a relationality to other things on the pole. And so that, I think, just speaks to the fact that linear frameworks may not work, and we may not need to sort of rethink entirely theories of change from a more Indigenous perspective. So lastly, just to close, I just want to thank the EVE project team in Samoa, who has done just amazing work so far, and really looking forward to working with them in the future as we go towards intervention development. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Jenevieve. Really interesting. And I think, yeah, as I listen to you talk, I guess it, you raise really this kind of whose voice, how do we privilege different kind of perspectives, and what do we do if we think things aren't fitting in with our kind of ideas of how the world should be, and different conceptualizations of science and kind of change, and also the process being as important as the outcome. I know that's one of your big themes. So yeah, really, really interesting. So that's brilliant. So now I think we'll turn it over to Laura, who she'll introduce herself, and then I'll hopefully be able to set the presentation off on mine, and she's got a bit of a dodgy internet connection. So Laura, do you want to introduce yourself? Then we can go.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm Laura Washington, and I work for Project Empower, which is an NGO based in Durban on the east coast of South Africa. And Durban is characterized by a large proportion of the population living in informal settlements. Many of those people in informal settlements are migrants, either from within the country, migrating from rural areas to the urban center, or they are migrants from outside the borders of South Africa. So very few people are actually can trace their families back a few generations in the informal settlements. And Project Empower has worked for many years in that context, working to prevent HIV and prevent violence against women. So thanks, Andy. If you can click go on the presentation.
Yeah, let's see if I can make this all happen. Thanks, Laura. Okay. Brilliant.
Project Empower is a South African NGO working to prevent violence against women, with funding support from the Sexual Violence Research Initiative and guided by Dr. Andy Gibbs, who was then with the South African Medical Research Council, as well as Dr. Jenevieve Mannell from UCL. Project Empower used co-development as an approach to developing an intimate partner violence prevention intervention for young women living in urban informal settlements in Durban, South Africa. In our past work, we and others in South Africa have learned that young women in urban informal settlements experience extremely high levels of intimate partner violence. Some studies showing that more than 65% of participants experienced IPV in the past 12 months. Our previous efforts and the efforts of others to develop interventions to protect young women against intimate partner violence have not shown meaningful reductions in women's experiences of IPV. So we wanted to work closely with young women to understand their lives more deeply and enable them to guide the development of an intervention. What we found, looking in the literature, was that there was not much to guide us in the day-to-day practice of co-development. The project was initially planned as an 18-month exercise, and we eventually worked on the project for a total of 24 months, partly because of the repeated COVID lockdowns that we experienced. We started the project by recruiting and hiring 4 young women who worked with us as young peer research associates, or YPRAs, as we came to refer to them as. They were unemployed and partly dependent on piecework and other strategies for generating an income. And to compensate them for their time and to enable them to remain committed to the project over its 24-month cycle, as well as to demonstrate our appreciation of their contribution, we hired the YPRAs as full-time members of our team, placing them alongside the rest of the team as colleagues at Project Empower. We designed and implemented an extensive set of participatory activities which we conducted with the YPRAs. These participatory activities consisted of exercises such as artifact collection, where we asked the YPRAs, it was actually over a Christmas period, to take photographs of objects, social events, or just incidents in their lives that captured some aspect of their life. We also did story completion exercises with the YPRAs, and these and other activities formed the basis of problem analysis, where we worked alongside the YPRAs to really deepen our understanding of what were the drivers of intimate partner violence in their lives. Ultimately, we worked with the YPRAs to develop a theory of change, which spoke to interventions, which spoke to possible areas of intervention that could be focused on in order to prevent violence from intimate partners. And then using theatre testing activities and other activities, we jointly developed a short intervention and then tested the short intervention with another group of young people from the community that we were working in. The final intervention that we arrived at aimed at improving communication skills between young couples. And this is quite significant because up until that point, as the designers of interventions aimed at preventing violence against young women, we hadn't thought that it was possible to work with young couples in urban informal settlements, given the complexities of relationships that exist between young people in those contexts. We were drawn to co-development as an approach because of its commitment to centering participants or beneficiaries as experts in the analysis of problems, the design and execution and evaluation of interventions. But we learned, though, that the relationships created in the process of co-development were shot through with tensions, including complex power dynamics, which related to skills and experience sets, class, race, and workplace hierarchies. First and foremost, the starting assumption in the project, of course, was that it was the young women who had the problem and that it was their lives that would be held up for scrutiny. While there may have been space, and the space was certainly used at times, for self-revelation from the research team, it was clear to everybody involved that that was not the purpose of the project, but rather that the purpose of the project was to understand at a very deep level the lived realities of the YPRAs and how these lived realities contained within them the drivers of intimate partner violence. What this did was immediately and inevitably place the young women in an inferior position, reinforcing their self-stigmatization, which we learned was intense. Leading from this, the young peer research associates living in poverty experienced the rest of the team as older, middle class, and educated. Some of us were white, which further reinforced historical colonial hierarchies, where young Black and female identities are subordinated. We unwittingly reinforced, in fact, even concretized this hierarchy when we employed the YPRAs and established an employer-employee relationship between ourselves and themselves. While we were attempting to compensate the YPRAs for their time and learn about their lives, the YPRAs, none of whom had previously been in formal employment, wanted to ensure that they did everything that they could to retain their jobs and wanted to perform as ideal employees, doing nothing to jeopardize their employment status with us. This meant that for some time they were reluctant to describe aspects of their lives that they felt would taint our perceptions of them, including patterns of alcohol and other substance use. It took many months to develop the necessary trust that would result in a deeper revelation from the YPRAs about those and other aspects of their lived realities. But it wasn't just the YPRAs who struggled in their relationship with the co-development process. We found that for the researchers as well, the absence of conventional qualitative research methods led to increased insecurity about the value of the knowledge being produced. Ultimately, we learned that neither the researchers nor the YPRAs had the answers. As much as the researchers acknowledged their lack of understanding of young women's lives, the YPRAs themselves needed to develop their analytical muscle and reflect critically on their lived realities. In many ways, it was a consciousness-raising process for the YPRAs. Despite the challenges inherent in the process, we found the co-development project to be very beneficial, delivering a rich, detailed, nuanced analysis of young women's lives and a much clearer understanding of why interventions may not work well. It also helped us to develop a much better understanding of what interventions are possible and guided us to a point we would not otherwise have reached, namely working with young couples. Despite the difficulties and complexities inherent in the process, we remain committed to co-development methodologies in our future intervention development efforts. We do quite a lot differently in future though, and one of those would be to structure a proper relationship building formation period into the project rather than going straight into the process of participatory qualitative data collection. The research team and the YPRAs need to get to know one another, need to develop trust, need to learn what can be said and what can't be said, and how to receive information that is being presented. But it's not just the researchers as a group that needs to get to know the YPRAs as a group and vice versa. The YPRAs also need to get to know one another and to develop a level of friendship and trust between themselves in order to engage more fully in the process. After this initial formation period, relationship formation period, we would also want to allow sufficient time for the development of a much deeper analysis of lived realities. And this relates back to what we were saying earlier about the process being in many ways for the YPRAs a consciousness-raising process. Their initial analysis of their lived reality was quite different from the analysis that they had at the end of the project. And an example of that is that it was initially taken for granted by some of the YPRAs that violence was an inherent part of an intimate partnership. Towards the end of the project, though, all of the YPRAs had moved to the point where they understood violence to be unacceptable. Further, we would always wish to compensate the YPRAs for their time and feel that this is a really critical element of a co-development project when you are working with vulnerable young people who are not in employment and whose livelihoods are fragile. We would, though, seek other ways of compensating YPRAs for their time, not as employees, however. Thank you for your time, and thanks also to the donors, SVRI, for their generous support, to Andy and Jenevieve for their support, and to the Project Empower team. And lastly, of course, to the YPRAs for their involvement and commitment in the process. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura, for that. And hopefully the sound worked well. I think, yeah, it was really interesting. Again, we've got this big question about knowledge and kind of how to think about different ways of thinking and kind of different ways in. And also, again, the issue of process comes up, you know, the need for consciousness raising in that. So that was really interesting and kind of contrasts well with Genevieve's. So now we'll move away from violence against women, and Katie will present on work she's done with Tatiana on human-centered design processes around that.
Thanks,
So can I hand it over to you?
You may hand over. I'm just going to set my timer so I don't chew your ears off. So let me get my slides up. Okay, hopefully that's looking good. So I'm going to present to you a project that I worked on with Dr. Tatiana Taylor-Sailsbury, who was the project PI. So it was a project, Project Catalyst, which was from, I think, about 2018 to 2020. And the idea was to co-design interventions to support young mothers in their mental health during the perinatal period in Mozambique. So I'm going to talk you a little bit through the project and then hoping to focus particularly on what went wrong, what went right, and what we learned moving forward. So the type of co-design that we used for this project was human-centered design. I'm going to give you a bit of an intro to that in a moment, but essentially human-centered design requires taking a complex problem that touches sort of multiple areas of society, areas of people's lives. It tends to be social elements, financial elements, emotional elements, really messy problems. And we try to unpick those and start to address these problems. So the complex problem we were thinking about in this project was teenage pregnancy. So we know that from a global perspective, teenage pregnancy is a health priority, but there's millions of girls who become pregnant before 18, and actually they don't have much support to thrive if they do become pregnant, because a lot of the funding and focus is on prevention rather than assisting girls who do get pregnant early on. So we know that Mozambique has the 5th highest percentage of teenage pregnancies globally. So 43% of girls have a baby before they're 18. Then thinking about the mental health aspects of this, estimates obviously vary depending on contexts and what scales you're using, but the rough estimate is that about 50% of teenagers who are pregnant have some kind of mental health problem during this pregnancy. And these obviously can continue once the baby's born. So the problem is, how do we support these young women who do have babies quite early on? So the Catalyst project was the project that came up with to address this complex problem. So we used a human-centered design approach. Again, I'll get to that in a second. So we worked with about 65 girls and young women, so sort of mid-teens to mid-20s. We spoke with their families, we spoke with community leaders, service providers, and government representatives, trying to get from sort of very low-level girls living their day-to-day life all the way up to Ministry of Health, so we could get a kind of mixture of levels to look at this problem with, so getting those different lenses to view the problem. We then identified key challenges that impact the young girls' mental health, and also prototyped solutions to see if we could come up with an intervention which improved these young girls' well-being. Just to say, this project came from a kind of mental health background, but we took a very broad brush approach to what mental health meant in this project, and it was very much any type of promotion of well-being was seen as an important part of mental health. So it didn't have to look like a sort of typical psychosocial intervention in order to be considered as a solution to sort of improving the lives of these young women. So just to show where we were, we've got Manisa district, this little red blob down at the bottom of the map of Mozambique. So way down in the south, quite close to Maputo, the capital. Okay, so as promised, here is a little bit about the human-centered design process. So for me, having worked with sort of participatory research, co-design, human-centered design, all of these different schools working with participation are big proponents that the way that they're doing it is the correct way. My personal opinion is perhaps that there's too much back and forth about the theory and which one is superior, when really we're all aiming for the same goal. So for me, the human-centered design process is just a tool, a sort of framework that we use for participatory research. It doesn't have to stand alone or sort of knock someone else's methodology out the water. So I'm going to explain how the human-centered design framework works. So 5 different phases. First phase is empathizing. So deciding who this complex problem that you've identified actually touches, who's involved, who's impacted, who causes the problem, who suffers from the problem. And again, we're talking about messy problems. So these tend to be quite big, diverse groups of people. We get them together and start to understand the problems from their perspective. So we as researchers went in and said, we know that there is a global health priority around young pregnancy. We see that as something to solve, something to create solutions for, but is that how young girls getting pregnant actually feel? Do they see that it's a problem, or are they actually quite happy to enter motherhood, even if it's at quite a young age? So then you sort of redefine the problem from the perspective of the stakeholders. So you get their opinions about what are the problems within the problem, essentially this big complex problem that you've identified. And you start to pick out key priority challenges within this complex problem. Then you go big again. So you've defined it, you've narrowed it down. Then you start to think of lots of ideas of ways you could address these priority challenges. So brainstorming solutions and ways that you can sort of start to improve these problems that you've identified. Then narrowing it down again, you try to find 1 or 2 of these challenges and think of ways that you can solve them. So HCD is quite nice because it really encourages being quite creative at this phase. So we tend to create a kind of fast, cheap, physical mock-up. So some teams use Lego to build something that they can take back to stakeholders to show a solution, or you might use technology if you've got tablets, or build something with paper, or something that people can look at and really engage with, rather than it being all theoretical throughout. Once you've got that prototype, you're going to take it to your stakeholders, you're going to test it out ask them if they would use it, would this intervention work, get some feedback and refine this prototype into a solution that is acceptable and desirable by your different groups of stakeholders. So thinking about the groups that we spoke to for Project Catalyst, so we had young women and their families, and we also spoke to service providers. So I'm just giving you an idea here of some of the key problems that were raised by these different groups and how we synthesize these down to start thinking about solutions. So the young women and girls and their families, their key concerns were around unemployment, having for these young girls to move into their partners' homes, and in society in Mozambique, when a young girl gets pregnant, that baby is part of the male partner's family, so they'll typically move into those homes. Typical problems with mother-in-laws ensue. Something that we found kind of across the board that was that the young girls were really happy to be pregnant, even if there were a lot of complex issues around it. The pregnancies were often celebrated not only by the young girls, but also families, despite the fact that there were other problems that followed. Dropping out of school was one issue that came up quite a few times, and also financial worries. Manisa is a rural district, high levels of poverty, so of course finances are going to come up. The service providers were thinking about the fact that these young girls didn't have a lot of health knowledge, they weren't showing up to their appointments, they weren't seeing a lot of the partners joining in and supporting these young girls, the fact that these young girls didn't really seem to have much choice in their situations, and that they had these multiple responsibilities. So you can see there the two sort of different perspectives. So synthesizing those together, we thought sort of the key challenges that we wanted to create solutions for were how to look after physical and emotional health in the mum, how to look after babies, how to adapt to changes in life circumstances, promoting financial stability, and strengthening social support. And the intervention that we came up with, along with the stakeholders, was the Mama Feliz intervention, so the Happy Mothers. And this consisted of group sessions for the young mums to build skills, one-to-one sessions where it was indicated that the young mums had higher levels of mental health need for interventions, and also creating some family sessions for partners and families to learn more about what the young girls were going through. So I wanted to now focus in on a few challenges that we faced using HCD in this project, just to get a bit of learning out of it. And I think it's important to talk about what went wrong. Not necessarily what went wrong, but what we learned from. So negotiating power dynamics and flattening hierarchies was a theme that came up time and time again. So whether this was within the staff of the project, so the research teams within Mozambique versus the international team members, and how communication was possible between the two. Sometimes the field workers, it seemed, were quite nervous to report back on anything that wasn't going perfectly according to plan, which was, of course, really useful information for us on the UK side, but we really had to encourage them to be honest and transparent. Pardon me. Then within the stakeholder groups themselves, you obviously have gender dynamics, so the young girls and the partners, younger and older stakeholders, professional, unemployed. So working out what groups to put people in so that they feel comfortable to speak openly, but also to learn from each other. Then getting buy-in for a flexible methodology. So this is a tricky one with co-design, especially when you're thinking about pitching for these projects, getting funding, working with ethics boards, researchers and stakeholders, to say to everyone when you start the project, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. We don't know what the intervention is going to be, how long it's definitely going to take and how it's going to turn out. But that is the process itself, is to work things out from these consultations. So getting everyone on board with that was a little tricky. And then keeping the design process accessible for everyone. So as you can imagine, we are working with stakeholders from a variety of different backgrounds, different cultures, different education levels, and also different languages. So from designing workshop materials in English, translating them into Portuguese, and then delivering workshops in the local language, which was Shingan, there's quite a few levels there that we need to work with so that everyone's included. Successes. Everyone agreed that asking these young mothers how they felt, what they thought was important, was a real success of the project, because typically these young mothers are really at the bottom of the pyramid in society. And they built a lot of confidence through being engaged by the project to talk about what they needed and say what was difficult and what was working for them. Success was developing something that the young mothers really wanted, and this success was amplified by the fact that partners and families said, well, what about us? This looks great, we want to be included. So that was a real win, that multiple stakeholders wanted to be involved in the intervention. Then the fact that we used Project Catalyst as a proof of concept that human-centered design was feasible for designing a mental health intervention in a low resource setting. So from the success of the Catalyst project, we followed up with a wider study called Inspire, which is currently going on in Kenya and Mozambique. Similar project, more funding, bigger timeline, to then start to roll out the interventions that we design. And finally, the project learnings that we're incorporating into this new Inspire phase of the project, making sure that we're balancing the needs of the research team and the needs of the stakeholders. So sometimes when we were focusing too much on what the young girls want, we didn't realize that the field workers were working crazy long hours, didn't have quite enough time to familiarize themselves with the workshop materials and had to feed back too quickly. And they weren't telling us until we really stopped to check in about what was and wasn't working, how much of a struggle it was. So having these regular check-ins and being able to pause field work while you get everyone on the same page was really important. Making sure that the workshop content is deliverable and really succinct. Don't tire out your researchers and stakeholders. Also, don't be afraid to use technology to bring tablets into the field rather than printing and doing big post-it notes and stuff. And then finally, maintaining balance. So when you're working with stakeholders, you want to encourage people to think big for innovative interventions, but you also want to manage their expectations. You can't come away with all of these young girls thinking they're going to get a cash transfer for the next 15 years. You also want to stimulate interesting discussions with the young girls and the stakeholders, but sometimes there's just silence, so you need to suggest a few ideas to get things going, but you don't want to lead the stakeholders too much in any direction, because obviously it has to come from their perspective. Okay, that's it from me. I will hand back over to Andy.
Great, thanks, Katie. Really interesting. I guess you know, one of the things which has come up, you know, in yours, and you kind of clearly said it, was the way these kind of projects can balloon and balloon, because each time you find something new and interesting, you think, let's add on extra, let's do a bit more research, let's kind of explore here, and it becomes overwhelming. You know, and I saw in Genevieve's like 240 community consultations, and I know that work with Laura as well, that we often find we collect lots of data and struggle to kind of manage it, and kind of well, partly manage it, but also it just becomes an overwhelming project. It becomes more than anyone can cope with. And so that's like a really important point of co-development, or these kind of you know, ones where we try and centralize other people's voices. And the other thing which popped up really well was around language and translation and the complexities of that. And Genevieve touched on it a bit around different meanings of words. But yeah, something else that we should probably explore in the discussion we have in the formal round table. So that was brilliant. Really interesting. Thanks for that. So then our final person is Jane. She'll be talking about work she's done in South Africa with youngsters, younger people still. So Jane, you ready?
Thanks.
There you are. Fabulous.
Thanks, Andy. I'm Jane Ndungu. I'm currently based at Nelson Mandela University. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we did in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, which is where I've done most of my work to date. And the work I'm going to talk about today was for a PhD study, which was supervised by Dr. Andrew Gibbs, where we were really interested in understanding, is it possible to co-develop participatory interventions online with young people? And I'm going to reflect on some of the challenges and also some of the strengths that we found in this work. So I'll just share my screen here. Yeah, just a second. Is it good to go? Can you see it, Andy?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background on the work that we did. And co-development of interventions with young people is a really important approach to achieving relevant contextualized interventions. But often, young people are excluded from intervention development because we often think of them as naive and we think they're vulnerable, right? Yet, we know that adolescents are very much aware of prevailing debates regarding their sexual health, and they are able to critique them. And we saw this in our study, which I'm going to briefly speak about in the next few slides. The aim of the study was to co-develop an online participatory prevention intervention. And we worked in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, fully online, over a period of 5 sessions, with a group of 4 young people, ages 18 to 19, but they were all in high school in the Eastern Cape. And looking at some of the strengths of this work, we found that young people were able to build rapport easily online. And this was both with a facilitator, myself, and also amongst themselves. So building of rapport amongst each other would have resulted from their previous relationships, because some of them had existing relationships from school, going to the same schools, and also coming from the same neighborhoods, and that might have helped a bit with that. And with a facilitator, this might have been because of using the video link. And the youngsters all actually say this to us. They say to me that they were able to relate better with me because they could see me, and they were able to see the nonverbal cues. So that might have facilitated the building of rapport. I think another strength was the energy the young people brought into the space. that they were very keen and they participated actively in the session. And they said they enjoy that autonomy that they experience in the space, that room to think, the opportunity to be really involved. But initially, to begin with, they were reluctant to participate because they said they came in expecting a lecture, which is, how they are instructed in the classroom. And most of the interventions that are delivered to them are often that didactic instruction, the lecture. So after explaining the process to them a bit and asking their views, they were very surprised, and they were pleasantly surprised that they were central to the core development. And when it was clear to them that they were central to this process, they started coming to the fore and actively engaging. So a key issue or a key consideration for interventions will be for us as researchers to enable such a space, especially with young people who are used to being instructed. And I'll touch on this again in the next few slides. On the practical side of things, working around school times helped because we were able to work with young people after they'd come from school. So they'd go home and then we'd get online on Zoom and work on the intervention design. So we're able to work at a time when they were not running from class to class, and they were also able to work in a space where they said they felt it was a safe space because they were either in their own room or maybe in a study. But in this space, they were able to be honest, to voice their honest opinion without the fear of, being within earshot of someone. They would rather not hear them say some things. Especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where some young people are uncomfortable discussing, matters of sexuality around parents or even older peers. So that availability of a safe space remains a key consideration of these core development processes in the future. And specific to online process, young people having personal devices helped because we only had to provide them with data. So it made it cheaper for us. Also, it was important because although we did not come across the case, if we had people who did not have devices and we were not able to provide these devices, we might have inevitably excluded them from the process, meaning that we would have missed out on these voices. So provision of practical resources, whether it's in face-to-face interventions or online, will be very important in future. But again, we also have to be careful around the safety and ethics of providing these resources, especially to children. And especially when we're working in resource-constrained households, because this may trigger unfortunate outcomes. So we need to be very careful and deliberately come up with context-fitting ways to involve young people. Then shifting now to some of the challenges we encountered, I think the big one for me was communication. Dialogical communication was very hard. Young people were afraid of giving wrong responses, and they kept checking with me if their response was correct. And this reflects the dominant form of instruction in South Africa. And I also caught myself using that term, correct, which again reflects my form of my experience of education. But I would quickly, retract and avoid reinforcing that way of thinking, the didactic. But it was very hard. I must admit, I felt sabotaged by my experience of education. And this remained a struggle throughout the process, which means that when we're working with young people in core development, we have to continuously, deliberately remember to avoid that didactic communication, which is not easy. And this complexity especially is compounded by the different forms of knowledge between the facilitator and the young people. So for example, I came into the process with the scientific knowledge of what works to prevent violence. And then I was met with young people's lack of formal training in violence prevention. And then I had to struggle between striking a balance of creating a supportive environment where young people can voice their opinion, but also engage in the discussion without a sense of correct answers and correcting young people's discussions from a scientific evidence stance, which is very hard. For example, I think the main one was young people kept bringing up creating awareness on sexual violence as key to behavior change. And we know there's legal evidence on this. So every time they kept bringing it up, I struggled with, do we say, well, that doesn't work. It's evidence does not support this, or which would have, again, reinforced that feeling of didactic communication in the space, or let them carry on with it and ignore the scientific evidence, but give them that feeling of being heard, of being central to the process and leading the process. So how does one maintain that autonomy of thought in a core development group, but also incorporate scientific evidence? So that existing imbalance in knowledge in the topic is a challenge in achieving a true dialogical process. We also had an equal participation amongst the adolescents themselves, with the more talkative adolescents in the group coming to the fore and the quiet ones remaining behind, not talking much, right? And when I encouraged them to talk, when I tried to coax them to come in and participate, there was that feeling of being a teacher in front of the class and soliciting participation from everyone. So there was that constant tension again around using unequal power relationships to encourage authentic participation by all learners. So again, in participatory processes, we may unintentionally reinforce existing inequalities in groups, either amongst the adolescents, but also between an adult facilitator and the adolescents. And the final challenge that I experienced was obtaining parental consent, which was very difficult. And this prevented some of the young people who would have otherwise wanted to be part of the process from participating. So co-development with young people is possible. When young people are given the space, they're able to actively participate, and they're able to critically reflect on some of the drivers of violence and come up with also ideas on how to prevention activities of prevention. But we need to have a collective effort in the group to enable dialogical communication. Because when we recognize young people's agency and in the group, they're capable to critically come up with suggestions on how to bring about change. Thanks, Andy.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jane. There we go. There we both appear there. That was really interesting. And yeah, also kind of very brave might be the right word to reflect on kind of the limitations of your own practice in relation to the co-developers, because often we want to kind of look at other things, other problems, rather than how we relate to the process. So really important, because without that self-reflection, we'll never improve. And again, I think just this importance of the safe social space and building young people's confidence came through in Katie's, came through in Laura's presentation, came through in yours as well. Really important that these are often new spaces for people who typically haven't had the space to voice their opinions and to be seen as meaningful actors. And I guess that's the central point of co-development, isn't it? To get people's voices who don't normally get included and to centralize them. Maybe that's the main theme. It's not really what we call it, but what we do that's really important. But I think then overall, that's all the presentations we're doing today. and then we will do the round table at a separate time. So yeah, thanks ever so much to everyone who's managed to listen to this point. And then Jenevieve, should we quickly go on and say goodbye, and then can stop the recording? All right, so thanks everyone who's watched this, and thanks everyone for presenting. It was really interesting to hear everyone's reflections.
Thanks for facilitating, Andy.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.